Hi, I'd like to welcome you to the COVID-19 protocols in Canadian and United States academic libraries. This project was sponsored by the Association of College and Research Libraries Value of Academic Libraries Committee. The subcommittee members that specifically studied the protocols are listed below, and with this appreciation for the work that they've done on that. My name is Holt Zaugg, and I'm the one that will be presenting the findings today. So to start out with, I'd like to review kind of the timeline. Starting in fall of 2019, the subcommittee met for the first time, and we decided to try and look at the protocols that were used by academic libraries to help counteract the effects of the pandemic. We looked at our own institutions and the institutional libraries that were near the subcommittee members, and then expanded from there to look at other institutions and the protocols that they were using. By the end of the fall 2019 we had changed this process and used this to develop a series of survey questions that we vetted amongst ourselves, and with the help of the VAL committee and ACRL, refined them. In the start of 2020, over several weeks, we administered the survey to collect data and find out what protocols had been used to that point in the pandemic. And then from February until July of this year, that we took a look at the data analysis and dissemination and created this webinar, and that included the report that's going to be available at the end of this webinar. And we also have created a set of raw data that's de-identified for others to be able to use that should they wish to. I'd next like to start and talk about the survey components. We had 6 components in our survey. The first one was demographics, and we took a look at the kind of things that we thought people might be interested in being able to disaggregate the data in comparisons from one type of institution to another. We then looked at 4 library operations: services, resources, people, which included both library employees and patrons, and spaces. And you can see the corresponding number of questions in each of those sessions. We also had a section that had general questions that didn't fit into any of these previous categories, but that we felt were important to be able to ask of those responding to the survey. We used a wide variety of questions, multiple choice, that included both single and multiple answer questions. I should note, because of the changing practices, when there were multiple choice questions, most of them were multiple answers so that we could have people select all the responses that replied. We also looked at alternate responses of yes, they did, or no, they didn't do something. We had some open-ended questions that were longer essay type questions, as well as some short answer questions and matrix questions that were more of Likert scale type questions for libraries to be able to rate where they were on the scale. In order to send out the survey, we decided to use an approach that was more familiar with us, that we used our personal contacts in the professional organizations with which we belonged and sent it out through those contacts and listservs, inviting people in the respective libraries to participate. Included in that invitation was the request to forward the invitation to other colleagues for which they were aware of that would have an interest or be willing to participate in this survey. As the survey data collection continued, we took a look at all of the states and provinces which had at least one institution respond to the survey, and made a note of those. And in those states or provinces where we had not had an institution respond, we targeted specific institutions with a request to ask them to respond to what COVID practices they were using in their library. So some of the demographics you can see with the map. The green indicates all of the states and provinces that responded to the survey. There was 43 of 50 states and 6 of the 13 provinces and territories in Canada who responded to the survey. This included 215 survey responses, 61 of which were duplicate or incomplete. The duplicate responses were eliminated. The incomplete responses we used as much as possible. 152 of these responses indicated that they had a website or a LibGuide dedicated to the COVID-19. The report has a list of the websites in one of the appendices at the end. The most responses came from Illinois, which had 18, and Georgia, which had 14 responses. We should mention that depending on the size of the institution, some institutions had more than one physical library on their campus. And in those cases, we asked each of the physical libraries to respond to the survey so that we could hopefully try and parse out some of the differences and similarities within an institution. Next, I'd like to take a look at some of the demographics. As you can see, 40% of those that responded were doctoral or research institutions, with almost half offering a baccalaureate or master's degree. And if you're looking at the student population, over half of the responding libraries served institutions with student populations of 10,000 students or less, and almost 75% of the responding libraries served institutions of 20,000 or fewer students. When we initially collected these were something that we had hoped to be able to use for parsing out and doing some disaggregation to compare. But as time proceeded on, we realized this was beyond the ability of what we were able to do given the manpower and time. So that is why we have included the data set that will be made available at the end of this presentation. For the remainder of the presentation, we'd like to discuss the findings that we have, and we'll be discussing it in the order of services, resources, people, space, and then the general section. We should make clear that we are not going to discuss all of the findings. To be able to do that, we ask you to see the full report. We didn't feel that there would be sufficient time in this webinar to be able to report all the findings to the extent that we would have liked to. And so we encourage you to download the report and, if you wish to, the data set. Not all institutions responded to all of the questions. In some cases, there was skip logic used so that the total number of questions were reduced if it didn't apply to the institution. And in some instances, libraries chose not to respond to the question for whatever reason, and we respect their choice to do that. Starting with the first one in our findings with services, and looking at the question, which research or reference services were you offering? And we can see that there was a move away from in-person contact and increased use of virtual contact. That was either desk or subject library consultations via virtual means such as Zoom. There was contact via email, chat, or telephone. Those were the dominant methods where they didn't have to have in-person contact. The other section referred to services such as scanning offered by some but not all libraries. And in the other section for comments, we were told that some libraries, although they didn't have services per se at the desk, if someone came up and wanted to have in-person, then they would work to meet those needs, but they were really encouraged to use more virtual means to have contact at the service desks. The next one we ask is what information and access service separate from reference desks were being offered. And again, you can see that this came along with a move to the virtual. There was an indicated move towards having some separated contacts, so there was distance between the library employees and the patron. And this is where we saw something spring up of a great deal of curbside service or a stacks pickup where a patron would call in for a specific resource, and as a service, the library employee would bring it to the curb so the patron didn't have to leave their car, or they would put it on a secure stack so that the patron could come up and pick it up at their leisure, not having to have any contact with the library. And this went for student holds and faculty holds, and it was a lot of the retrieval of delivery services moved to this method. Other comments specifically discuss specialty checkouts such as laptops or room use or increased digitization to be able to access resources in that way. We also asked a series of questions about how normally scheduled events in the library were occurring, and what ways the library's building hours had changed, how interlibrary loan services changed, and how library instruction changed. And we found that there was in all of these cases, there was a rapid shift in modality and approach for the core services and how they approach things. There was a transition to online learning with synchronous sessions, but asynchronous content in what was being presented to students. Those librarians that responded and commented on this indicated that there was a steep learning curve, and some felt that there was a teaching regression. One respondent indicated that they felt that the library instruction regressed to some bibliographic instruction rather than the full information literacy instruction. So there was kind of a reducing down to the bare bones of what instruction could entail. Others looked at this as an opportunity to learn new skills of how to present material online, and they looked to expand their instructional repertoire with the hope that this would carry over post-pandemic, that they'd be able to continue to provide library instruction and to use these skills beyond. Most libraries shortened their hours or closed, and this varied by what was happening at the pandemic and in the broader community. That there was direction that was received from governments to universities to libraries, and in some cases the libraries had shortened hours and then closed and then opened with shortened hours, and so it changed throughout the pandemic. Nobody increased their hours during it, and interlibrary loan, both physical and electronic, continued for just about all libraries. There were only 4 libraries who discontinued any interlibrary loans that responded to the survey. Now taking a look at resources, we asked if the library stacks were left open for browsing, and if they were left open, was there a time limit? We found out that 62% of those that responded kept the stacks open and accessible to students. Of those who kept it open, 82% did not have a time limit. And for those who did have time limits, the time limits varied widely. One institution, for example, had a 20-minute pass for students to go in, quickly find their materials, and return to the entrance to check them out and then leave. Another allowed students to make reservations to use the stacks and actually be in the library. And these ranged amongst libraries from time limits of 30 minutes to 8 hours that they could book the time for. There, as you can see, there was just a wide variety of when there was time limits, what the time limit was. And again, all of them, just about all institutions reduced access to the libraries to just those that were in the library community. The broader community members were restricted, and there were several institutions that required a current health badge that indicated that they'd been scanned for safety. Most institutions also had a copy and scanning service for students and faculty, but not for the community members. And 3/4 of the survey of those surveyed expanded their online access to resources. We also asked if special collections materials were accessible, and you can see that the 2 common ones continued, that in-person, what reverted to by appointment only. There was very few that allowed just in-person drop-ins, and online access to special collections materials to be able to see. And you could see that there were 28 institutions that closed their special collections, so there was no access at all during the pandemic. The other thing that we looked at with resources was how long items were quarantined when they were returned. And if you're taking a look at the bottom with the key there, that there's books and other print materials, laptops and other technology, overwhelmingly all were quarantined for at least 72 hours, with the exception that the laptops and other technology in some institutions had no quarantine or reduced quarantine times. And we feel that was probably because of the harder surfaces that were easier to sanitize and clean than the books and print materials, but we're not definitely sure on that one. The next one we looked at was people and findings, and we looked for libraries that allowed employees and others into their physical spaces, what protocols were required to be followed. And in this instance, we found that the protocols that were used in libraries were very similar to the protocols that were in the general community. So, for example, there was physical distancing. There was the encouragement to stay home if you felt sick at all. There was frequent hand washing. Some required, many required screening protocols to be able to enter the library. They had regulated traffic flow. So people going both directions were not in close proximity to each other, but there was a one-way in and one-way out. They had some kind of eye or face shields or masks or goggles that were in public areas. But if you look at the fourth set over there, library employees who had a private area or an office were allowed to take those off while they were working in those, whereas students were required by and large to continue wearing them even when they were in a more private area. And if you look at the far right, you can see that more institutions required students to have COVID tests than they did of library employees, although that was common for a fair number of institutions. We also asked in what ways was compliance to the COVID-19 protocols enforced, and enforcement largely rested within the library employees. In some instances, university employees or students were hired specifically to patrol for enforcement. In others, libraries required compliance checks as students and patrons that were allowed in entered the library. And again, there was also signage indicating that broader community members weren't allowed in the library, that only current students and faculty were. If there was repeated or severe non-compliance, the three common responses were that the people were asked to leave from the library, they were expelled, or if need be, campus police or library security were called in to assist with compliance to the protocols. 10 libraries did not enforce compliance at all. The next one we looked at was the work from home options that were in place at your library. The option was encouraged or offered by most libraries, that they encourage you to work from home where possible, unless your job required you. The overriding theme was try to find a way to make things work where you didn't have to be present. And if you did come in, there was multiple libraries that indicated that they used a tiered or share work schedule. So where there may be several people in one area, they alternated their schedules so that fewer people were in that area. So there was fewer people working together, and the things that they could do at home, they did at home, and left the things that they could only do at work. And all of them were very flexible to government direction, that when direction came out from there, that from the government, they looked to try and follow that. There were 34 institutions that required its employees to work from home, and the library was closed. And there was 20 institutions that only allowed people to work from home if they had special underlying medical conditions. And 7 had no work from home policies in place. And I think a lot of those ranged because of the size of the library. At the institution, what type of work travel restrictions, and we're not discussing commuting to and from work, but rather the work travel that's connected to the library and the university. Overwhelmingly, the work travel was stopped, that there was no work travel allowed, or if it was allowed, it had to be approved by university leadership, or there was no out of state or out of province travel allowed, or no overnight travel allowed. There was 11 institutions that didn't restrict overnight travel. But when you think about how many of the library meetings and conferences switched to an online format, there really wasn't a whole lot to travel to. We took a look at who can access library spaces, and if you take a look at the top 6 responses, you can see that it forms everybody that is in the institution community. So undergraduate and graduate students, library employees, non-student library employees, and the one exception were trades and maintenance people that didn't work for the institution, that were working on projects in the library, that they were allowed in, but they still followed the COVID-19 tests and screening prior to allowing access. What public access areas of the library were closed as a result of COVID-19? We saw an adjustment for anything that was group meetings areas were restricted or closed, and individual areas were opened but distanced. And you can see that the conference rooms, group study rooms were often closed, or group study rooms were adjusted to smaller occupancy, large meeting areas. In 35 instances, library space, all library spaces were left open by institutions. And when they asked which areas were modified, and this was a select all, you could, as with many of the others, you could select all. The study tables were modified, and we see a lot of modifications included reduced occupancy. There was lounge seating. Group study rooms were either closed or reduced capacity, or in some cases were changed to Zoom rooms for people to hold Zoom meetings where they didn't have access to Zoom for where they were living. And individual study desks. Other modified areas included computer desks or stations where some computers stations were removed so that it created a distance. Referent desks were spaced out with protections put in place, and public service desks and cafes. And there were some instances where some areas were closed due to non-compliance. So for example, if there was a particular area of the library where students were not complying with the regulations as stipulated by the library, some libraries would close that area off for a few days, kind of saying, and put up sign to say, we've closed this because you weren't complying with the regulations and you're not allowed to be here at all. Patrons have their favorite spots to study, and this was somewhat effective in that when it opened up, that they knew that they had to be compliant for the space to be able to remain open. So it was kind of a two-edged sword working to help there. We asked how the spaces were modified. As you can see, plexiglass was installed at a lot of the help desks. There's directional signage. There was single direction doors. So instead of being able to go in and out of any door, there were specific doors designated as entrance, specific doors designated as exit. There were physical dividers, taped off areas, and queue paths, all designed so that people could physically distance one from another and not run in face to face with each other. We asked what modifications were made to furniture. There was greater space put between furniture and reduced occupancy. You can see for the example here with the desk, the table that would normally hold 4 chairs was down to 2, and they were at kitty corner from each other. Some furniture was removed, and some types of furniture was removed. In some institutions, they indicated that they took out the cloth furniture versus the hard surfaces because the cloth was harder to clean and sanitize than the hard surface furniture. We also asked how the changes were communicated to library patrons, and this is going to be a repeating theme with other communications methods, that it was from new signage, there was university media, either from websites or newsletters, there was social media, and then the reference desk was a key one for how we were able to communicate what was happening and changes. We also had library-specific websites that communicated changes, and there were emails sent to faculty and staff generally indicating what changes were going to happen prior to it being made known to the public so we could prepare for those changes. Have any library spaces been modified as a result of COVID-19? And if so, how? We found that 126 of 138 libraries responded and modified. As I said, that there was most space and occupancy capacities were reduced. Sanitation and building cleaning were improved and increased. The sanitation stations were put up in places where they previously hadn't been. Access to vending, water fountains, microwaves was decreased. So if there was 2 water fountains within close proximity, in some institutions, they closed down one of the water fountains. So there was reduced number of cleaning that was needed to keep things safe. Most libraries followed the directives that came from the university, who followed directives that came from the government. And there was very strong alignment with this chain of going from government to university to the library of what to follow. And with the changes, there was additional costs. But we found that 77% of the libraries reported that they received some to strong support from the university to making these costs. And it wasn't just monetary, there was other ways that they received support. Only 7% of libraries received no additional university support to introduce and use the protocols. Moving into the general section, we asked what forms of COVID-19 safety awareness resources were developed and adopted to support library staff and users. If you take a look at the top three, communication is king. There is stronger communication within the university, within the library, and between the government, both local, state, national, and the institution. Communication became paramount. There was also increased training for staff, and there was modifications to food and drink policies, all guaranteed to help keep employees and patrons safe in what they were in as they were accessing the library. Only 1% of the responding libraries indicated that there was no safety awareness resources that were developed or adopted. We also asked the formats that were used to share these safety awareness protocols. And as with the announcements, they were pretty much the same as that there's physical signage, the library's website, and social media postings were the primary methods to be able to communicate these. Finally, at the end, we asked if there was anything else about COVID that libraries wanted to share with us. And we found out that as we read through these, that it revealed some really strong organizational strengths and successes, as well as organizational weaknesses and challenges. And these centered around three aspects: players, sentiments, and tools. So with the players, there was the idea that there was many people on many levels who needed and used greater communication and cooperation. People were forced to talk to each other and cooperate if things were going to happen, and they're going to happen successfully. And when this didn't happen, friction occurred. There were also multiple libraries who indicated where previously they were kind of told what to do by the library, by the university or institution. They now had a place at the table because the library was one of the big congregation places and was one of the places that they wanted to make sure that people were kept safe. And so this gave them a place at the table for talking about campus protocols. The sentiments were a wide range. There was frustration with all the way to appreciation for leadership, both at the university and library level. We all realize how quickly and how fast protocols changed through the course of it. And there was a sentiment that people wanted to say, this is the new protocol and it's going to stay this way. But the nature of the pandemic didn't allow that to happen. But there was appreciation expressed that university and library leadership were doing everything they could to keep patrons and the students safe and to be able to maintain the use of the library and have a sense of normalcy. And for this reason, there was just constant changes to the environment and guidelines and rules. And finally was the tools. And in this one, we felt that the strongest tool that the library had was the library employees. They responded to COVID-19 with ingenuity, with flexibility, cooperation, and a commitment to their core values and being able to maintain service and access to their patrons. And I think it stands as a testament that this in a sense was not only the greatest challenge for librarians, but it was also one of their finest hours in the way that they responded to it. I think it's something that as things die down, that librarians deserve a proverbial pat on the back for saying we did well, we did our very best on this. There were some key quotes that kind of brought out some emotions and sentiments that I felt were important in discussing our report. And I wanted to refer to these towards the end here. The first one is, I am personally heartbroken over how few students were in a formally vibrant and active space, but I'm working hard to ensure that it is only temporary. I think any library that was left open saw a dramatic shift down in the number of patrons and students that attended their library, and all are working to see as that we return to normalcy, hopefully this fall, that we become that space where students can congregate and collaborate and work together and learn together. The second sentiment was students are hurting for a place to study as other spaces close down. Making the library available has been important for keeping our students sane and safe. And I think this is an important sentiment of one of the core values, that the library is a safe place for people to go, both physically and mentally, that it feels like home to them and it feels like they're safe there. And in some instances, the library was a lifeline where people didn't have access to internet where they lived and where they worked. Excuse me. The third comment was, we are establishing a new foundation for how our library operates over the long term. And it was talking about taking a look at how things had changed in the library. And in some instances, there was the comments and the sentiment that we've made these changes and we're not going back, or we're not going all the way back, that we're going to continue to use some of these. And that's expressed by the final comment of, I'm extremely proud of our team and believe that we will emerge from this pandemic a stronger library team. I will encourage staff to adopt some of our new ways of working to our post-pandemic ways of working. And I think that adoption and adaptation is a key element of what we do at libraries. There were some limitations to our study. First of all, dealt with the protocols. They changed rapidly during the pandemic, and to channel a little bit of my inner Star Trek persona, it was a lot like trying to hit a bullet with another bullet while both are traveling at the speed of light. It was incredibly difficult to keep up with all the constantly changing protocols and to be able to respond to that. Because of those constant changes, the subcommittee had an incredibly difficult time writing questions that would be able to capture that experience of all the changing protocols and what protocols were used. And similarly, those who responded to the survey had difficulty responding to questions because of the wide range of protocols and changes that happened at their institutions. The third limitation dealt with restrictions to data collection and analysis. The ACRL VAL committee typically picks projects that they can work on for a year, and we try to start and finish a project within a year. And you can see that we're hitting very close to the deadline with this being presented in August. These time restrictions limited what we could do and how well we could do it. I spoke earlier of how we would hope to disaggregate data, but we just did not have the time and resources to be able to do that. We had also hoped that it would have been good to have the survey administered at a couple of different times to be able to see how things changed as the pandemic changed. But that was beyond the scope of what we were able to do also. And we also took a look at the survey, examined what protocols were used, but we didn't examine their efficacy. We didn't say how effective were these in reducing the spread of COVID-19, and we didn't also look at the compliance, the efficiency of compliance to these protocols. Again, that was beyond the scope of what we were doing. And finally, because of the way that we sent out the invitations, we tried to be as inclusive as possible, but we do recognize that some groups and types of institutions may be underrepresented in what we're finding. As we finish off, we have some future directions, and we have 4 suggestions. First of all, we felt it was important to create and maintain a comprehensive list of academic libraries and institutions. And this would allow anyone for when there's a next time event of this magnitude to both collect and disseminate information in a rapid order. And I don't say this lightly, because there are literally thousands of post-secondary institutions, and to be able to compile and create this kind of a list would be a gargantuan task. But had we had this list, we could have been more inclusive, and we could have reached out to all institutions to kind of say, what were you doing, so that we can learn from each other. The second suggestion is that there have been a number of studies on COVID-19 in libraries that have been published and disseminated prior to ours. We felt that a meta-analysis of these studies would be helpful to find out what was asked, why it was asked, how the information was used, and to be able to see the areas where we complemented each other, where we were similar, where we were different, to be able to create surveys and measurement tools for future events such as this. We also felt it was important to create a repository of COVID-19 protocols and practices so that when the next pandemic or emergency comes, whether it's in 10 years or 50 years or 100 years, we're not starting at square one, that we can take it, someone else in the future can take a look at what we did and learn and build from what we did so that they can react in a more efficient and speedier efficient way. Finally, we also took a look, there was a greater emphasis on soft skills, such as the communication, creativity, adaptation, cooperation, the skills that are hard to measure. And we felt that there needed to be greater emphasis on this in education, not just for students, but in the education and training of library employees, as these became critical in helping things succeed at the library. Finally, we'd like to provide some acknowledgements. We are very grateful for the support we received from the Association for College and Research Libraries and the broader VAL committee. What we did as a subcommittee was strengthened because of their input and support for us. We also want to thank the institutions who completed the survey and shared what they were doing with their COVID-19 protocols. We realize that in the middle of a pandemic, when you are rushing to make changes and accommodate and work with protocols, the last thing you want is someone to come and ask you, well, what are you doing? And we appreciate them taking the time to be able to share that with them in a really hectic time. I will let you know that just prior to start of this webinar, I received notice that the report and raw data are now located at this website. These slides will also be posted there shortly after this presentation, and they're there for you to download and be able to use. We also hope that some of the subcommittee members will be able to post the report on their institutional repositories so that it becomes as widely accessible as people would like to know. I'm going to leave this up for just a side. We're moving into the question sections now, but I'm leaving it up in case anybody wants to take a look at that website to be able to jot that down, to be able to download the report and the data set. But that is essentially our presentation, and we're open to any questions that may come from, that it may have been come from the chat. Thank you. It looks like Laura Spears has posted the link to where you can download it on download the report and data set in the chat box. So if you wanted to, you could be able to find it quickly there. The survey did not inquire. There's one question asking if the survey inquired about staffing level changes. There was not any specific question asking about staffing level changes, but there was comments made that they were trying to keep normalcy, and they tried to keep as many library employees as possible where they were able to, but we didn't specifically look at that. Any of those comments were just openly volunteered to us. I'm not seeing any other questions that are popping up. Are there variables you would include now that were not originally included? Oh, yeah. The one on staffing levels would be, I think we would have tried to get a sense of efficacy of how effective things worked and how well they worked. Were it possible, I think if we could have compared what protocols were used to infection rates on campuses, would have helped to indicate efficacy if we were able to collect those. And I'm sure that the other committee members would. My committee members were far smarter than me, and so I trusted them to bring up other ones, and so they probably have other ideas that might come from there. as I said at the start, we didn't look to, there was a question about differences from public to private. We didn't ask a public-private question, and we didn't disaggregate. We only reported, we've only had time to look at all the data as a complete whole instead of disaggregating to separate ones. But, and we didn't look to try and have public versus private. Are there variables? Let's see. Jeff Bullington put in, one of the members, that another thing we thought of later was differences in rural versus urban, which would be another demographic identifier that we'd have. Does the data set include the duplicates? I'm not sure what you mean there. Laura, if you could clarify that a bit for me, please.
Can I turn my mic on?
Yes.
You said that you removed duplicates when you did your analysis. I just wondered if this data set also includes those duplicates, or if this is with the duplicates removed.
We removed the duplicates from the data set, and we also we're trying to be as thorough as possible to remove any identifiers that would identify any institution, so that that privacy was preserved. But there are no we removed the duplicates for it. It doesn't look like any other questions are coming in. And so with that, if there's other ones, you're welcome, as I said, to download the report and the data set, and to contact us or email us individually to be able to find it. I will put a plug in. If any of you are looking for service opportunities, the Value of Academic Libraries is just a wonderfully strong community of librarians that look to describe the value of academic libraries, and I encourage you to apply to be able to join us. So we welcome all people coming in to be able to do some. This is the last of several wonderful projects that we're undertaking this year, and it's been a privilege to be able to work with the people that we have and to learn the things that we did. With that, Lois, I guess we're pretty much done, and you're welcome to stop the recording, and we thank everyone for coming today.